She lost everything and was sleeping in her car until a K9 German Shepherd sniffed out a secret hidden in her trunk that would turn her entire life around. Here's what happened. But before we get into the story, drop a comment below. Let us know where you're watching from. The metallic taste of fear curled under her tongue as she fumbled for composure, swiping at the condensation fogging her window with a shaking hand. Outside, the silhouette of a man stood motionless against the backdrop of corporate glass towers, his security badge catching the reflection of the lot's harsh floodlights. She recognized the stance before she even saw his face. Officer Dane Mercer, the one who walked the lobby halls with the kind of silent authority that made even executives fall into line. His German Shepherd, a massive, dark-coated sentinel named Rocco, stood rigid at his side, his keen eyes locked onto the trembling form inside the Corolla. Brielle swallowed hard, her mind racing for words that might make this moment hurt less, but all that came was a thin whisper. I'm just resting, she managed, though the tremor in her voice betrayed the lie. Dane shifted, his broad shoulders casting a shadow across her cracked windshield, and with a quiet nod to Rocco, he stepped closer. The low, warning growl from the dog sent a chill down her spine, and that's when she realized Rocco wasn't growling at her. His attention was fixed on the trunk. Her pulse quickened, her thoughts spiraling. Had someone tried to break in? Had she done something wrong? But before she could react, Rocco lunged toward the back of the car, his powerful paws scratching at the metal as if the secrets she'd buried there were a matter of life and death. "Open it," Dane commanded, his voice low but edged with something urgent, something she couldn't quite place. Her hands felt like ice as she reached for the latch, the trunk popping open with a reluctant creak. And there it was, her entire life laid bare under the unforgiving fluorescent lights of the lot. A worn-out mattress flattened from weeks of use, a threadbare pillow with faded embroidery that read "Sweet Dreams," a duffel bag stuffed with what little remained of her wardrobe, and tucked carefully atop it all, a small, weathered teddy bear missing one eye, Harper, the last gift from her mother before the hospital stays took everything. For a moment, the air itself seemed to hold its breath. Then, in a move that stole what little strength she had left, Rocco leapt into the trunk and, with a heavy sigh, curled up on the thin mattress as if to say, "You're not alone anymore." Dane stood there watching, his eyes unreadable, his jaw clenched so tight she could almost hear his teeth grind. And just like that, the iron walls Brielle had built around her heart cracked open. Tears welled up, hot against the freezing night, blurring the edges of the world around her as she collapsed against the car, sobbing not just for tonight, but for every night that had led to this one. And in that moment, with a K9 guardian claiming her last sanctuary as his own, something shifted. For the first time in weeks, maybe months, she wasn't invisible. And in the haunting stillness of that cold parking lot, Brielle Hart realized that sometimes rescue doesn't look like flashing lights or outstretched hands. Sometimes, it looks like a loyal dog lying quietly in your darkest corner, refusing to leave until the world starts paying attention. The world seemed to narrow to the pinpoint beam of that flashlight, every humiliating moment of the past month replaying in her mind with brutal clarity. The eviction notice creased and stained from being read too many times. The unanswered job applications. The nights spent praying for a miracle under the suffocating silence of her car ceiling. All of it crushed down on her chest like a weight she couldn't breathe beneath. She kept her hands in plain sight, trembling against the steering wheel as if she were some criminal caught in the act of existing. "Step out of the vehicle, Ms. Hart." Dane's voice came again, quieter this time, but firm, like a verdict already passed. Her frozen fingers fumbled with the door handle, the loud metallic creak of the hinges sounding like a scream in the stillness. As she stood, the frigid air bit through the thin fabric of her hoodie, her threadbare sneakers crunching against the frosted pavement. Rocco remained poised beside Dane, his ears perked, his deep brown eyes locked onto her trunk with unnerving focus. That low growl rumbled again, more insistent now, as if some hidden truth lay just beyond reach. "Is there something in the trunk you're not telling us about?" Dane asked, his gaze cutting through her like a blade. Brielle swallowed hard, her throat raw from nights of silent sobbing, her voice barely more than a rasp. "It's just my things," she managed, but even to her own ears it sounded like a confession. Dane lifted his chin toward the security chief still standing nearby, his hand resting lightly on the holster at his side. "Pop it open," he instructed, his eyes never leaving hers. Her heart raced, every instinct screaming to run. But where would she go? The streets were colder than this parking lot, and at least here she could pretend she wasn't completely invisible. With a shuddering breath, she pressed the button on her key fob, and the trunk slowly lifted, the small interior light illuminating her hidden world. The mattress, the worn blankets, Harper the one-eyed bear perched like a sentinel guarding memories she didn't dare revisit. And then, with the kind of quiet grace that seemed both tragic and heroic, Rocco moved. His powerful body leapt forward, landing in the trunk with practiced precision, and he settled down on her makeshift bed, his massive head resting on the thin pillow as his eyes lifted toward hers with something that felt dangerously close to understanding. Dane stepped forward, his expression a battlefield of duty and something far more human. For a long, heavy moment, no one spoke. The flashlight beam lowered, the tension shifted, and in that icy parking lot surrounded by concrete giants and silent witnesses, Brielle felt something she hadn't in what felt like forever. Seen. Not as a problem to be removed or a policy violation to be corrected, but as a person standing on the razor's edge of survival. And in the quiet companionship of a dog refusing to leave her side, she found the faintest spark of hope that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't beyond saving after all. For a moment, the world stood still, the frigid air thick with something heavier than winter's bite, a silence so deep it seemed to swallow sound itself. Brielle's lungs felt tight, her breath caught halfway between shame and disbelief as she watched the legendary K-9 officer curl into the fragile remnants of her life like he belonged there. His massive body settled into the thin mattress with a sigh so human it cracked through the last of her defenses. Rocco's eyes lifted toward her, those deep, knowing pools reflecting the weariness she'd fought so long to hide. Dane stood frozen, his gloved hands clenched at his sides, the hard lines of his face unreadable under the harsh parking lot lights. This wasn't part of the training manual. K-9 units didn't offer comfort. They enforced control. But here was Rocco, a creature trained for war zones and criminal chases, resting in the wreckage of her life like he'd found his mission. And somehow, in that moment, it felt like he had. Dane finally exhaled, his breath a cloud in the freezing air, his voice low and rough like gravel dragged across stone. "He's never done that before," he murmured, more to himself than anyone else. Brielle swallowed hard, her vision blurring as tears welled unbidden. She didn't want to cry in front of them, not after all the nights she'd trained herself to stay silent through the storm. But there was something about the way Rocco refused to move, his head now resting gently against Harper the one-eyed bear, that shattered her careful walls. He's just tired," she tried to whisper, but her voice cracked, betraying her. Dane turned toward her slowly, his eyes softer now, the sharp edge of protocol dulling under the weight of what he was seeing. "He's not tired, Ms. Hart," he said quietly, his gaze flickering between her and the makeshift bed his partner had claimed. "He's standing guard." And those 3 words hit harder than any eviction notice or pink slip ever had. In a life defined by closed doors and unanswered calls, by nights spent curled beneath a ceiling of cold glass and forgotten dreams, someone, or something, had finally decided she was worth protecting. Her knees weakened, the adrenaline fading into exhaustion as she leaned back against the cold steel of her car, her arms folding around herself in a feeble attempt to stay whole. Dane rubbed a gloved hand over his jaw, his eyes never leaving the sight of his decorated partner settled in the heart of her heartbreak. "He's choosing you," he added under his breath, and it sounded almost like a confession. And for the first time in too long, Brielle didn't feel invisible. She felt chosen. And that, more than the warmth she'd long forgotten, more than the promise of shelter or a job, was enough to keep her standing in the frozen dark, daring to believe that maybe, just maybe, this was the moment her story began to change. The sun hadn't even fully broken across the skyline when her phone lit up with the call that felt like the final blow. She sat there in the driver's seat of her battered Corolla, hands trembling against the cracked leather wheel, staring at the glowing screen as if ignoring it might somehow make the inevitable disappear. But reality didn't bend to wishful thinking, not in her world. With a hollow breath, she answered, her voice barely steady as she confirmed she'd be right there. By the time she walked through the grand revolving doors of the office she once took pride in calling her second home, every eye in the lobby seemed to follow her steps, their gazes a mixture of pity, curiosity, and something colder, judgment. The same executives she had greeted every morning with a practiced smile now couldn't meet her eyes, their polished shoes shuffling away as if her presence might stain the marble floors. She pressed the elevator button with fingers that still bore the faint marks of a restless night, gripping the edges of a thin blanket, her mind racing through futile what-ifs. When the door slid open, Dane was already there, standing stoic in his uniform, Rocco sitting tall and silent at his side like a shadow that refused to leave her. His nod was subtle, but it carried the weight of an entire conversation she wasn't sure she could survive. The walk to HR felt longer than it should have, each step echoing against the hollow corridors lined with plaques she once dreamed her name might grace. Inside the glass-walled conference room, the HR manager sat waiting, his expression painfully neutral, his fingers tapping rhythmically against a manila envelope that seemed to pulse with finality. Without ceremony, he slid the papers across the table, his eyes flickering over her shoulder to Dane before landing briefly on her face. "Ms. Hart, this is a formal termination. Violation of company policy. Creating a safety hazard by residing in your vehicle on corporate property." His words were as cold as the air she'd slept in, each syllable cutting through the thin armor she had left. Brielle tried to swallow, to find words that could explain the months of struggle, the sleepless nights spent working overtime to pay for a mother lost to a cruel disease, the quiet sacrifices made while the world kept turning its back. But the words refused to form, drowned by the suffocating weight of humiliation. She signed the papers with a hand that barely felt connected to her body, her vision blurring as the HR manager offered a thin, professional smile and stood, signaling the meeting's end. Dane moved closer then, his voice low and fierce against the rising tide of despair. "This isn't over," he said, his jaw tight, his eyes locked on hers with a promise she didn't yet understand. And as she walked out of the building that had once held her future, her shoulders heavy with loss, but her step steady despite it, Rocco fell into step beside her, his silent loyalty a reminder that even when the world slammed doors shut, sometimes it only took one unwavering companion to find a new path forward. It started with a single notification, a soft chime from her battered phone that lit up the cracked screen like a flare in the darkness. Then another, and another. By the time the afternoon sun dipped low enough to paint the city in shades of exhausted gold, her inbox had become a wildfire of messages, her name splashed across timelines and news feeds she never imagined she'd be part of. Someone, a stranger with a sharper eye and a kinder heart than most, had filmed the entire encounter in the freezing parking lot. the trunk creaking open to reveal her fragile sanctuary, the threadbare mattress, and the one-eyed teddy bear named Harper perched like a guardian over her tattered life. And then, the moment that seemed to silence the entire digital world, Rocco, the legendary canine, stepping into the trunk and curling up as if to shield her from a world that had already turned its back. The video spread faster than she could comprehend, the title simple but impossible to ignore. When a K-9 officer protects more than just the law. Within hours, trunk of hope was everywhere, splashed across social platforms, whispered through coffee shop conversations, filling the airwaves of local news segments with teary-eyed anchors recounting the unlikely bond between a woman society tried to forget and a dog who refused to let her disappear. Her phone buzzed relentlessly, each new message a mixture of hope and heartbreak. "You're not alone, Brielle," one read. "Stay strong. We see you now," said another. But as the words poured in like a flood through a broken dam, reality sat beside her in the passenger seat of her freezing Corolla, a colder companion than the winter wind rattling through the cracked windows. Kind words didn't pay for the gas she no longer had the money to buy. Hashtags didn't put food in her stomach or find her a place to rest that wasn't a parking lot watched over by indifferent security guards. And no viral story, no matter how heart-wrenching, could rewind time and erase the eviction notice or the final days of her mother's fading memory when she'd sat helplessly by that hospital bed, holding a hand that no longer recognized her touch. She scrolled through the messages with numb fingers, her breath visible in the frigid air, every ping of compassion both a balm and a brutal reminder of how far she still had to climb out of the pit life had buried her in. And yet, even as the hopelessness tried to creep back in, she glanced toward the back seat where Rocco sat, his massive head resting patiently on the center console, his warm, steady eyes watching her as if he understood every silent battle raging behind her tired eyes. He was still there, still choosing her. And though kindness couldn't pay the bills, and hashtags couldn't heat her frozen world, the weight of Rocco's unwavering loyalty pressed against the cold like a promise that maybe, just maybe, this storm wouldn't last forever. The night had folded in thick and heavy, a blanket of darkness that seemed to press against the thin walls of her Corolla with a suffocating finality. Brielle sat motionless in the driver's seat, the cold having long since settled into her bones. Her thoughts a tangled mess of exhaustion and fragile hope, each heartbeat louder than the last in the silence. Then came the softest knock, not the sharp rap of authority, but something gentler, hesitant, like the person on the other side wasn't sure if he was crossing a line. She turned her head slowly, her eyes swollen and raw from the hours she'd spent scrolling through messages of strangers offering hope she couldn't yet afford to believe in. And there he was, Dane Mercer, the man whose entire life was built around control and order, standing out there in the dark like someone who'd lost his own way. Before she could react, Rocco bounded from the cruiser and pressed his head into her lap through the half-open door, his warm breath fogging against her frozen fingers, his eyes lifting toward her with a sorrow that didn't belong in a creature known for strength and command. She buried her hands in his thick fur, her tears falling freely this time, not hidden behind the lie of strength, but raw and unapologetic, because for once there was someone there to catch them. Dane eased into the passenger seat beside her, his uniform creaking under the strain of a body that carried more weight than muscle alone could explain. He sat there in the dark, staring through the cracked windshield at the empty parking lot beyond, his jaw tight, his eyes distant like he was somewhere else entirely. And then, in a voice low and roughened by years of battles no one else had witnessed, he whispered, "You don't deserve this. No one does." His words hung in the air between them, fragile and powerful all at once, the kind of truth that didn't need to be argued or explained. She turned to him then, really looking at the man behind the badge for the first time, And what she saw wasn't the hardened officer who patrolled the corporate halls with authority, but a man worn thin by grief and regret. A man who understood exactly what it felt like to lose everything and still stand in the ruins, trying to protect what little remained. He didn't tell her it would be okay. He didn't offer hollow promises or solutions wrapped in pity. He just sat there, his shoulders heavy with unspoken stories, his hands resting uselessly in his lap as if he wanted to help but didn't know how. And somehow, that honesty, his quiet, broken presence, meant more than anything anyone had offered her since this nightmare began. In that car, surrounded by the cold and the dark and the heavy silence, two people who had spent far too long surviving their own private wars found a rare and fragile peace. And as Rocco pressed closer, his steady warmth anchoring them both to something real, Brielle let herself believe, for the first time in a long while, that she might not have to face the darkness alone. The days slipped past like pages torn from a book she couldn't stop reading but didn't want to remember. Each one a repeat of the last, yet somehow slightly less unbearable, because now she wasn't entirely alone. Dane had a way of showing up without warning, his squad car idling quietly near her battered Corolla as if it belonged there, as if he had nowhere better to be despite the crisp professionalism of his uniform and the long list of obligations she knew he was supposed to answer to. And Rocco, with his silent understanding and heavy head always finding its way onto her lap or shoulder, became the kind of company that didn't demand conversation, just presence. But it was during those quiet nights when the world fell asleep and the city lights blinked like tired sentinels that Dane's walls began to crack. His words slow and hesitant, heavy with the burden of a life that had demanded too much and given back. Too little. He told her about his wife, how cancer had stolen her smile first and then everything else. How he'd sat helpless in a hospital chair holding a hand that grew colder by the hour until he couldn't feel the warmth in his own fingers anymore. And then came the silence, the kind that stretched for days and weeks and years. His son's silence. A boy who had once run into his arms at the end of every shift but now barely acknowledged his existence. A teenager buried behind headphones and locked doors, lost in his own war zone where Dane's uniform couldn't reach him. The badge he wore so dutifully wasn't a symbol of pride anymore. It was armor, a shield against emotions he couldn't afford to feel, a weight strapped to his chest that kept him moving forward even when every part of him wanted to collapse. And through it all, Rocco had been there, the one creature who never turned away, never held back his affection or questioned his worth, the only living being who saw the man beneath the uniform and stayed anyway. Brielle listened, her own pain a mirror to his, her heart breaking quietly for a man who wore his strength like a mask and his grief like a second skin. In those shared moments, sitting side by side in the cold dark, their words fragile but true, something began to shift. She found herself laughing again, soft and hesitant at first, surprised by the sound of it. Dane smiled more, a rare and fleeting thing, but enough to make her believe that the world hadn't completely hardened him. And Rocco, always Rocco, remained their silent guardian, his loyal presence a constant reminder that even the deepest wounds could begin to heal when someone simply refused to leave. Together, they were three broken souls learning how to stand in the ruins without falling apart. And with every breath, every glance, every word shared in the stillness, the ice around Brielle's heart thinned, and for the first time in what felt like forever, hope found a way to slip through the cracks. The morning of the interview felt like stepping onto a bridge suspended over all the broken places she'd barely survived. The kind of fragile hope that could either carry her across or send her plunging back into the cold depths she'd fought so hard to climb out of. Brielle stood in front of the mirror in the gas station bathroom, her hands smoothing over the faded fabric of the one blazer she had left, the same one she used to hang neatly in the trunk as a reminder of who she used to be and who she might still become. Her reflection stared back uncertainly, the lines of worry etched deep, But beneath them was a flicker of the woman who once held boardroom presentations and believed in a future bigger than survival. Dane waited outside in the lot, his cruiser parked beside her Corolla like a silent statement that no matter what happened next, she wasn't walking back into the fight alone. Rocco paced beside the car, his sharp eyes watching every passing stranger like they might somehow pose a threat to the fragile courage she carried into that building. The nonprofit sat tucked between forgotten storefronts, its modest sign weathered but proud. Haven House, where new beginnings start. Brielle took a breath so deep it felt like it might shatter her ribs and stepped through the door, the warmth of the small lobby wrapping around her like a promise she wasn't sure she could believe in. The interview room smelled faintly of coffee and hope, the walls lined with photos of women who had found their second chances, their smiles wide and eyes bright despite the hardships they'd faced. Across the table sat Marla Jennings, the director, a woman whose presence felt both commanding and maternal, her sharp eyes softened by a kindness that didn't ask for explanations. Marla didn't start with a list of qualifications or a rundown of Brielle's gaps in employment. She simply asked, "What do you wish someone had done for you when the world got too heavy to carry?" And that's when the words poured out, unpolished but real, about nights in a frozen car, about the weight of invisible battles, about a dog named Rocco who curled up in her trunk and reminded her that even in the darkest corners, loyalty and hope could find you. By the time she left the building, the sun had climbed high into the pale winter sky, and her steps felt lighter than they had in months. As she crossed the lot, her fingers trembling around the edges of the offer letter tucked into her blazer pocket, Dane stood leaning against his cruiser, arms crossed, a slow, knowing smile curving the edges of his face. Rocco was already at her side before she could say a word, his tail thumping against her leg, his eyes lifted to hers like he'd known the outcome before she had even walked through that door. And in that moment, as the weight of uncertainty lifted just enough to let her breathe again, Brielle looked at Dane, her lips curling into a smile that felt like a sunrise breaking through a long and bitter night, and without needing to say it aloud, he understood. She had found her way back to hope. The first time Brielle walked through the doors of Haven House as a staff member rather than a desperate visitor, she felt the full weight of how far she'd come press against her chest. Not as a burden, but as a quiet, humbling reminder. She wasn't just there to manage programs or shuffle paperwork. She was there to reach back into the darkness she'd barely escaped and pull someone else toward the light. Every face she saw held echoes of her own past. Tired eyes that knew the language of survival. Shoulders hunched under the invisible weight of nights spent in cold cars or sheltered doorways. Hearts battered by a world that had forgotten how to care. And every time she sat down with a woman on the verge of giving up, she didn't offer rehearsed sympathy or the hollow promise that things would magically get better. She offered truth. She told them about the nights she shivered under a thin blanket in a parking lot, about the sound of her own hopeless breathing against the windshield fog, about the way the world feels when it moves on without you. But then she told them about Rocco, the dog who crawled into her trunk and refused to leave until the world remembered she existed. She told them about the man behind the badge who stood beside her when she had nothing left, who sat in the freezing dark and reminded her that she was still worth fighting for. And slowly, one conversation at a time, she watched those tired eyes flicker with the fragile beginnings of belief. Dane visited often, always with Rocco by his side, the legendary K9 now something of a folk hero in those halls. To the women at Haven House, Rocco wasn't just a police dog. He was a symbol, a living, breathing reminder that no matter how lost you felt, someone or something might still show up for you. The younger children adored him, their small fingers tangling in his thick fur as they laughed for the first time in weeks. Even the hardest cases, the women who sat silent and guarded with walls built higher than the sky, softened when Rocco padded into the room. his calm, steady presence breaking down barriers words couldn't reach. And Dane, though he never said much, became a familiar and comforting figure in those halls, his quiet strength a pillar when hope seemed too fragile to stand on its own. Brielle often caught him standing by the window, watching the women gather in the garden or the children playing in the courtyard, his expression unreadable but his eyes always softening when they found hers. And every time she passed him in the hallway, every time their shoulders brushed and their eyes met with the silent acknowledgement of two survivors still finding their way through the wreckage, she felt it deep in her bones. This was more than a job. It was a mission. And together, they were rewriting the endings for women who'd spent too long believing their stories had already ended. The ballroom glittered under 1,000 crystal lights, the kind of place she once thought was reserved for people whose lives had never fallen apart, whose hands had never trembled opening a car trunk to reveal their last shred of dignity. But here she was, standing center stage beneath that glittering ceiling, the soft murmur of the gathered crowd falling away as she traced her fingers over the small silver pendant that rested against her collarbone. A delicate charm shaped like a car trunk, its tiny latch etched with a quiet promise she carried with her every day. The speech she had prepared sat forgotten on the podium, her mind instead replaying the freezing nights spent curled beneath that Corolla's thin roof, the haunting silence broken only by the rhythmic sound of her own shallow breaths, the desperate prayers whispered into the dark. And then came the memory that never failed to bring her back to life. The weight of Rocco settling into the trunk beside her pain, his quiet, unwavering presence louder than any words ever spoken. The moment she stopped being invisible. Her eyes scanned the crowd, the faces of donors and dignitaries and women she'd helped guide through their own storms. But it was when her gaze found Dane across the crowded room that the world seemed to still. He stood near the back, his broad shoulders rigid in a suit that looked both unfamiliar and perfectly fitting, his expression a careful mask of pride and restraint. But it wasn't Dane who held her focus. It was Rocco, sitting faithfully at his feet, his wise eyes watching her like he understood every word. She hadn't yet spoken. That was when she knew. This wasn't a story about survival anymore. It was a story about resurrection. Taking a breath that felt bigger than her lungs could hold, she let the speech fall away and spoke from the place where all the broken pieces had been carefully stitched back together. There was a time, she began, her voice steady but thick with emotion, when I thought the world had forgotten me. When I believed I'd become nothing more than a statistic, another silent life swallowed by circumstances too heavy to carry. But sometimes, it's in the moments when you lose everything that you find exactly what you needed all along, not in grand gestures or perfect rescue, but in the quiet loyalty of someone, or something that refuses to leave. Her fingers pressed gently to the pendant, her eyes lifting once more to meet Dane's across the distance. That night, when a dog crawled into my trunk and refused to leave, it wasn't just a moment of comfort. It was a promise that I was still here, that I still mattered. And tonight, standing before you, I ask you to be that promise for someone else, to be the hand that reaches through the dark, the voice that says, I see you, and the presence that refuses to leave until hope returns. And as the room rose to their feet, a standing ovation crashing against her words like a tidal wave of redemption, Brielle Hart stood a little taller, no longer the woman lost in the shadows of a parking lot, but a testament to the truth that sometimes the smallest spaces, like the trunk of a battered old car, can hold the beginning of everything worth living for.